Okay, if you're here to learn a little bit about static asset caching, you are in the right room. A little bit about your presenter first. My name is Chris Burge. I'm a technical account manager at Acquia. Been in this role since April of 2022. My very first Drupal website was back in 2011. I was still in grad school. That was clear back in Drupal 6. Got my first contribution credit in 2014, and I created my first contrib module in 2019. Spent about 10, 12 years in development before I moved over into my TAM role at Acquia. All right, so for today's presentation, we're going to use this particular scenario as kind of an example to work through as we add additional tools to our toolkit. And for those of you who've worked with content creators, this is probably somewhat of a familiar scenario. But what we have is we have a nonprofit organization. Every year they put out an annual report, and they create a PDF copy of that report. They post it to their website. They copy the URL. They put it in a blast email, and they send it out to all 2,000 to 3,000 of their members or whatever. And works fine. They do this process the same every year. But this year, after they send the blast email out, they figure out that one of the financials in this PDF has an error in it. And so they need to fix it. So they go through, they fix the PDF, and then they upload it to the website, save the media entity, and they go about their day. But a few hours later, they notice that that URL in the email is still loading the old PDF with the error in the financials. Well, you probably run into the scenario before. There's a couple of things that are going on here. Pertinent piece of information, though. One is that we're running on Apache. The second piece is that we have Varnish sitting out in front of our Apache web server. This is a fairly common configuration for a Drupal website. So what happens, there were two things that happened here if you're just using a stock Drupal install. The first one is that they didn't actually replace the file. And I see lots of knowing nods. That's like, oh, _0. And that's because Drupal didn't actually replace it, uploaded another copy. The other thing that happened here is that out of the box, Drupal instructs Apache to set a cache control header, sets a max age of 1 year. Varnish respects that. So until Varnish is either has the entire cache for the site cleared, or you restart it, which also clears the cache, it's just going to keep serving up that old file. So as we work through the presentation today, we're going to keep coming back to this scenario as we chip away at this problem. So I wanted, the first thing we're going to talk about here is the cache control header. And that's that piece that instructs Varnish how to behave. And in fact, it instructs any external cache how to behave. So that could be, Varnish, Imperva, Cloudflare, etc. Your browser is also technically an external cache. A couple of headers that you may see out of the box for a vanilla Drupal site. The first one here, max age 300 public. If you set your Drupal site to enable caching, and here I just set it for 5 minutes, this is what you'd see if you're logged out. So public means that's telling external caches, like again Varnish, hey, it's okay to cache this, and you can use your cached copy, no questions asked, for 5 minutes. The second one, that's what you would see if you're actually logged into Drupal, if you have an authenticated session. That last part there, private, what that means is that only private caches, so not Akamai, not Cloudflare. However, your browser's a private cache, so you can cache a copy with this. But then there's some debate over these first two must revalidate's redundant, but what it's telling your browser to do is you can keep a cache copy, but check with me first before you use it. So there's two types of places, principally two types of content in Drupal where the cache control header comes into play. The first one's for dynamic content, so that's things that bootstrap Drupal and it provides a response. So if you load node/1, that'd be dynamic content. And the way you control that cache control header there is you go to your performance page and you go ahead and make a selection for browser and proxy caching minimum age. By default, when you just launch a brand new website with a standard install profile, it's going to have no caching. And so in that case, you would see that second cache control header where every request has to be spun up again. So this is for dynamic content, which isn't what we're talking about today. What we're going to be talking about is caching for static assets. And the reason it was important to point out Apache at the beginning is what we're looking at here is an excerpt from the htaccess file, which is part of, it's inside of the doc root, and it provides instructions for Apache how to behave. If you're using Nginx or something else, then this would be set elsewhere. But this particular excerpt, what it's doing is it's excluding any PHP responses, and it's only it's only affecting responses that are served directly by Apache. So responses where Drupal doesn't bootstrap. And what it's doing is it's setting a max age of 1 year. I figured exactly where they changed this. For the longest time, it was for 2 weeks. And then several Drupal core versions ago, it got changed to 1 year. Interestingly, what I found is that the majority of people, when they run their Drupal core updates, they don't incorporate changes to the htaccess file. So like I have like one customer who's running Drupal 11 today, and like this didn't get incorporated, so their static assets are still caching for 2 weeks. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, so now we need to have a detour into philosophy. Raise your hand if you think the user uploaded files should be reusable. I think we have we have a couple people there. So the developer is more likely to say no, because then that creates headaches. Marketer is more likely to say yes, because why not? I don't want _0.
You don't understand the problem.
Exactly, they don't understand the problem. So this would be a very short talk if we decided no, file name shouldn't be reusable. We could just skip the rest of the slide deck and go grab some coffee. That's not what you came for. All right, so if we're going to reuse file names, we have two problems. The first one is we need to figure out external cache invalidation. Because just because we swap out the file on the server doesn't mean Varnish knows about it, doesn't mean anybody else on the internet knows about it. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to talk about that Drupal core behavior. By default, user uploaded files are not deleted. So in like the case earlier, that file was already there. In the UI, I clicked remove, uploaded a new file, got there _0. That original file is going to keep hanging out forever, which is a problem because in that email, we have that original URL. And so in that case, like that problem, we can clear Varnish cache, but the problem ain't going away. So we need to figure out that issue right there. I put a link to the issue on Drupal.org where this whole discussion happened. It's very interesting. You can have an entire conversation just about this one issue. But we'll skip over that today and just know that by default, this is a behavior that we need to figure out. But don't worry, there's a module for that. It's the media entity replace module. It takes just a little bit of configuration, but what it allows the user to do is to replace the file instead of adding another file with that _0 issue. And interesting, like the APIs are all there in core. It's just that you need a contrib module to go ahead and add that behavior through the UI. So this gets us part of the way there. But we still have that issue with external caching. So we need to invalidate Varnish. We also need to figure out what to do about browser cache. So we're part of the way there, but we haven't solved it yet. If you're using a Drupal website that's behind Varnish, you probably already have the Purge module installed and the Varnish Purger contrib module installed as well. Purge provides a framework for invalidating external caches, and it has a plugin system that other modules like Varnish Purger can provide plugins for to handle invalidation externally. So you're probably running both of these already, which again gets you part of the way there, but we're still mixing some of the magic sauce. But don't worry, there's also a module for that. And that's going to be the Purge File module. What this module does is it uses hook entity type insert, hook entity type update, and hook entity type delete, targeting the file entity type. And it's going to react to changes for file entities. So when a file entity is created, updated, or deleted, it's going to add invalidations to the purge queue for the URLs of those files. So if we go back to our scenario now, because the media file entity replace module, we had that installed and configured, and now we're able to purge those URLs from Varnish. That gets us all the way through the caching layer on our hosting stack to take care of the problem. Well, we potentially could still have a problem with browsers because you can't invalidate browser cache. There's cache copies of your stuff all over the internet, and you don't know about most of it. So we can't invalidate the browser's cache, but what we can do is we can use our friend, the cache control header, to provide it instructions about how we want them to behave. So this is something you have to do up front as opposed to after the fact. So a few of, we've talked about max age, so diving a little bit deeper about how this works here. That's basically kind of a TTL for how long is this asset valid for that you have in your cache. It's important to note that max age value is relative to the first time the server serves that asset. Like when your browser loads it for the first time, that doesn't start the clock. It's when the server serves it up. So for example, let's say that you have an asset which is served up at exactly 1 o'clock with a max age of 3600, so 1 hour. What that's going to do is it's going to instruct external caches that for the next 60 minutes, you can use your cache to copy, no questions asked. When we hit that 2 o'clock mark, then the behavior changes, and the external cache is going to check first, and that's basically the same as the no cache directive. So what no cache means is, and these are all horribly named, what no cache means is that the response can be cached, however, you must revalidate with origin before you use it. So you can use but check first. Once that max age has been reached, then the behavior switches to no cached. There's also a no store, which does what you would think no cache does. No store is like don't store a copy this period. So this is naming things is hard. Naming things is hard. So I'm going to run through an example here of cache revalidation. So what we have is we have an asset that we're requesting, in this case a PNG, and it's the first time we're asking for it. So the first thing that happens is we send that GET request over to the server. The server gets that has the GET request and it's like, all right, hey, I have this file. It's going to send a 200 response with the payload with that particular image. It's also going to send over some additional headers, and one of those is going to be last modified, and that's telling our browser the last time that this asset was modified. Now, okay, so then they're removed. All right, so we're going to look at the same example here, but we've already requested the asset for the first time. So this is a subsequent page load. So in the first example, if you just ignore the bottom part of the screen, we're going to make that same GET request, but this time we're going to be sending another header over, if modified since. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that last modified timestamp from the first one, we're going to send it back to the server. It tells the server, this is the asset I have, this is the last time it was modified, can I use this from my cache? In this example here at the top, what has happened is that the asset has been updated since we last loaded it. And so when the server responds, it's going to respond with the 200 response, again with that payload, and it's going to give us a new last modified. So this is what happens if the asset has been modified. So we asked, hey, can we use this? Like, nope, but here's the updated copy. But the real value is what happens if the asset has not been modified. So what would happen is we would send that request over, same deal, if modified since. On the server's end, it's going to do some quick math. And it's going to be like, well, no, this is the same asset that I have. So instead of responding with the 200, it's going to respond with a 304, not modified, and it's not going to send a payload back. So this is a very quick, light response coming back. And so what happens there is my browser gets a response back, 304, okay, I'm going to use my cached copy. So that's an example of how cache revalidation works.
Question?
Yes.
In the lower example, should the if modified since not match the last modified that was returned in the top example?
Okay, hold on here. 2022, last modified. I think you may have found a bug. I'll have to take a look at these before I post the final PDFs.
believe Varnish.
Please Varnish. I have to take another look at that. In the preceding example, I used the last modified header as controlling the cache revalidation behavior. There's another one that's preferred. I used last modified because it's an easier way to introduce the concept. So with last modified, what you basically are looking at is a string which represents a date and a time. One of the limitations is you're limited to a 1 second granularity, which I think most of the time would be enough. But it is used as a fallback. If the E tag header is present, what that is that's more, maybe more machine friendly, but it's more precise and it's preferred. The representation is actually just going to be an opaque string, and it's going to be hashed from whatever you decide it's going to be hashed by. This is something that you would set at the server configuration level, like in your htaccess file. But you could hash the content itself, the timestamp, the size, a combination of those three things, and you're going to get your string back, and then that's going to be what's gets sent over instead of the if modified sense. So that's I guess that's the preferred way now, and it does take precedent. If they're both present, then it takes precedent over last modified. Okay, so we do have another trick, and that's smax age, which is shared max age. So it's max age, but for shared cache. So your shared cache is going to be Varnish, your CDNs. What it is not is your browser cache. So what happens is your shared cache, external cache, is going to ignore the max age, and it's going to use the smax age instead. So in this example here, the instructions that we would be sending out we'd be telling our shared external caches, you can use this for 1 hour, no questions asked. What we're doing here is we're telling effectively browsers you can use for 1 minute, no questions asked. So that's how those two would interact in that case.
You put the load on the cache, not the server.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
The first time I ran into the issue of static asset caching was actually with an Acquia Dam customer, and this is it's modified, but it's basically lifted from their htaccess file because the Acquia Dam module can be used in a couple different ways. One, you can load the asset directly from the Dam CDN. The other thing you can do is you can sync the files down and let Drupal serve them. Well, when you sync the files down, it's using the replace functionality for entity updates. So if you have an asset in Dam and you update it, like there's no _0 happening over there, and the updated file gets synced down eventually. So you would wind up in a situation where it'd be identical behavior to media entity replace or media file entity replace, and they're like, we're making updates to Dam, we're syncing them down, but we're not seeing them. And so the solution that we implemented there was for all the file types. You see there, JPEGs, the PDF is one of the important ones too. So what we ended up doing was they wanted the browser to revalidate every request, but they still wanted to leverage cache. They didn't want all those requests going back to origin. So this is the cache control header in this particular situation. Using cache control, max age of basically 1 hour for shared cache, and making the browser request every single time. You'll notice that JavaScript and CSS aren't included anywhere here, and that's because they're special, and we'll talk about them in a minute. If we check back on our scenario at this point, we've installed the media entity file replace module. So now we've replaced the PDF with the same name. We've installed the Purge File module. So now our external caches, shared caches, are being validated. And the last piece there, we've added that cache control header for certain file extensions. And so now we have the browser revalidating. So now across this entire stack, if we go back to the original scenario, and this is how we have things configured, then when the staff took those exact same steps, everything would just work. All right, well, what about JavaScript and CSS files? Well, as I mentioned, they're special. Anytime that you're using JavaScript or CSS files, they should be defined as part of a Drupal library, and they should be attached using the various attachments methods that are available for Drupal libraries. And that's important because assuming that aggregation is not enabled, core is going to append a cache-busting query string. So we're going to work through a quick example here. This is a super simple module. The first file is a CSS module, and the site I was working with was using the Olivero theme. So this was the CSS I had to use to make the body text red. So we have the CSS file. The second file is a libraries file. That's going to define a library with any associated CSS or JavaScript. In this case, we just care about loading this one guy here. And then the last thing is the module file, where I'm using a preprocess function to go ahead and attach that to the page element everywhere it's rendered. So basically I made it global. This is a quick and easy way of getting that CSS in there. And when I look at my browser tools, when I get it loaded, I can see that my CSS file is there. And then we have this query string after it. And that's the cache busting query string. And that gets generated every time the cache gets rebuilt. What it's leveraging is the asset query string service, which was added in 10.2. And the actual action in terms of generating that string actually happens in the asset query string class. This reset method, basically what we're doing is we're hashing the timestamp, and then we store it in a Drupal state system, so it gets stored in the key value table. And because all of you are clearing the cache as part of your deployments when you deploy updated CSS and JavaScript, this just magically works. But what if aggregation is not enabled? Well, there's no cache busting string appended, because if you look at this looks pretty unique to me. So we don't need that there. But there is a gotcha. And that's because those aggregated URLs are based on the assets, underlying assets. And the behavior is going to hinge on whether or not in your library you declare a version. In my example earlier, I didn't declare a version, and I'd argue that's the right thing to do. And the reason is, if no version is declared in the library, then what Drupal is going to do is it's going to use file get contents. It's going to look at my asset and it's going to hash it. And now it can compare if it's been updated or not. If I declare a library version, then Drupal is just going to trust me. And it's not up there now, but that library version I had. So if you have a custom theme or maybe a module, and you push out just a CSS update, and you don't declare, you don't increment your library version, that's going to confuse Drupal, and your CSS isn't going to get loaded the way that you want it to initially. That's because you forgot to increment the version. But there's been a behavior change. In Drupal 11.4, the library version is basically just disregarded because people forget to increment their library versions. And so it's just going to behave in a way as if library versions were never even a thing. And that was actually committed back on May 9th, and it was just released in Drupal 11.4. So a couple ways you can go about this. One, it's 3 lines of code. You could backport the patch, or you could just stop versioning your custom libraries now. All right, here's a fun little module that I wrote a few years ago. It was kind of exploratory, and those cache busting query strings that Drupal adds to CSS files and JavaScript files when it loads them via the libraries. Could we do something similar for user uploaded files? So that's what I wanted to see. So what it does is it uses some preprocess functions. It extends a couple of field formatters, and it also extends and replaces the image style entity class. And what it does is when those URLs are generated, it grabs the timestamp and creates a cache busting query string that's based on the timestamp of when that asset was last updated. So each of those pre-process functions, etc., what they ultimately do is they call this particular function, which maybe someday I'll make go OP, but not today. And you just pass through the timestamp, hashes it, and it returns basically a query string that can then be appended to the URL. So in the case of that annual report earlier, it'd be .pdf $CB equals, and then that string there. CB stands for Cache Buster. It's been pointed out to me that my initials are also CB, and I can't unsee that now, and probably neither can you, but just be assured that's not meant as some type of Easter egg. Okay, so one important thing is if you're going to use this module, and there's like 200 or 300 people out there using it in the wild, which I'd love to talk to these people. But you're going to want to make sure that you, with your Purge setup, that you're using either a path wildcard or a URL wildcard invalidation type. And that's because, like Varnish, it uses the full URL as a unique identifier for an object. So this, with that cache busting query string, is considered a different object than without the cache busting query string. So if you don't have this enabled, what will happen is that Varnish is just going to collect and keep serving your old versions of your assets. So if somebody goes directly to your let's say node/1 and they click on the URL, they're going to get the updated version there because that URL was updated there. But if that URL has been copied anywhere, maybe in a node or an email or Slack message, it's going to have that old cache busting query string on it. So you want to make sure that you use those wildcards so it'll invalidate those as well. Some practical considerations. Anytime you're making changes to your caching strategy, you really do need to test those end to end every time you make those changes. Specifically test your cache invalidations to make sure that those are working. So that's something that's just kind of a non-negotiable there. Also, test in more than just one browser, because we know just because something's a standard doesn't mean it's uniformly implemented. So I did some quick testing on my end, and it appears the major browsers, they do cache JavaScript, CSS, fonts, images. Got a little bit of different behavior when it comes to PDFs, and part of that might depend on the size of the file as well. But what I found is that Firefox and Edge, they were caching, but they were sending revalidation requests. What I found was that Safari didn't appear to be caching PDFs, period. It just wants the whole thing every time. And I couldn't test in Chrome because my organization has blocked the use of DevTools on this page. So I couldn't open the inspector when I had a PDF open. So I don't actually know how that works, how the world's most popular search browser works here. I would guess that because they have the same underlying engine, I would guess to be the same behavior as Edge. But I ran out of time to test that on my personal laptop. But that's why you do end-to-end testing to multiple browsers anyway. In terms of what would baseline recommendations be, well, it depends. It's really going to depend on your situation and what you're doing. If file names cannot be reused, then you as a developer probably don't need to do anything. So that goes back to that philosophical divide earlier. If your file names can be reused, then you're going to have to enable the reuse, first of all, probably by using media entity file replace. You're definitely going to want the Purge File module installed. And then from there, you could use the cache control solution that I provided earlier. You could also maybe try the static asset cache buster module. But it's really going to depend on what your use case is. So that first example where I was talking to you about the Aqua Dam customer, they're in the financial services industry, regulated. And so in that particular case, when they make an update, we can't wait for some process to run at the bottom of each hour to clear external caches. Things need to happen now, and people need to see the latest version in their browser now. So that was an example of why we were forcing the browser to do so much revalidation. And maybe we could have been differentiated the behavior between like PDFs and images. Maybe been a little less strict with images, but that's what we rolled out there. So it really kind of depends on what your static assets are, what your use case, what your requirements or regulatory environments are in. And then here's a list of modules that, full disclosure, I didn't actually download and run through each one of these before the presentation, but they're related. I'm familiar with the first two. And what they do is they allow you to download file entities based on their canonical path. So like /media/1234, like the media ID allows you to download them that way, as opposed to being tied to a URL with a file name that could change. That was one strategy. You can pitch it. Your stakeholders will probably tell you no, but it's a solution you can pitch to them. The third one is a module that allows for some customizations about how media links are rendered. The fourth one takes an approach where a link to a media entity is actually its own type of media type. So you have like remote videos, etc. So that's a different approach. Again, your content editors probably won't like that one. And then the last one is orphan files. If you do have orphan files in your file system, this can provide some reporting so that you can find out which ones are orphaned, and then to provide some tooling so you can go ahead and remove those as well. Because if you've had a Drupal website out there for a while, you probably have some orphaned files, and cleaning that up is probably, potentially a smart thing. But there's also some risks too, because just because it's orphaned doesn't mean that it's not still being used out there. So you'd probably want to check some analytics to see if you're getting clicks on those as well before you go remove the file. All right, with that, any questions or comments? Front row.
So I feel like I didn't personally pay a lot of attention to a lot of these headers like MaxAge and things until I started using testing tools like Lighthouse or Web Page Test. And I feel like Google in particular has been very pushy about saying that you should set the, I'm not sure if it's MaxAge, I think it is MaxAge to a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious with some of the things you showed where it's like MaxAge 0 but SMaxAge something further out, does that, is Google kind of kosher with that for things like Lighthouse Test, or do you just have to accept that you're going to take a ding on scores for sites where you use that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
As someone working more on the back end here, I hadn't considered that. That's a good point to bring up. One thing though is if you do have a CDN sitting out in front, you can, I believe you can, update those cache control settings there. And I think that the difference also may be on the types of media that we're referencing to, types of files. I would guess that Google is going to care about that a lot for things like images and CSS files, etc. And I would hope they would give PDFs a pass. Yeah. So we'll have to, that's something we could test out. That goes back to if I were to implement that cache control example from earlier, I would pull those images out of there and just have it targeted to PDFs, and then that issue kind of goes away. Right? There's nothing else. This is like me trying to end a customer call. If you see an organizer, thank them. It takes a lot of work to put on a camp like this, and none of us would be here without them. So just a quick shout out to our organizers as well. Nice. And with that, you're adjourned.
Thank you.